My name is Alyssa Hart. I am 35 years old. 3 months ago, at a Sky Lounge in downtown Chicago, my mother handed over the $10.4 million business I spent 12 years building to my older sister, Victoria, like it was a casual birthday gift. My mother slid the folder across the table, smiled, and said, "We've decided your sister will take over from here. It makes sense. She has kids. She needs stability." My father leaned forward and added, "You'll work under her. She deserves it more." I did not cry. I did not argue. I just let out a short, disbelieving laugh, nodded as if concluding a standard transaction, and walked out. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family? Let me know your story down in the comments. I'd love to know who is part of our community. I walked out of that Sky Lounge and onto the rooftop terrace, the cold wind off Lake Michigan hitting my face like a reset button. I did not wait for the elevator, and I did not wait for them to finish their appetizers. In my head, the numbers were already balancing themselves. I reached my car in the parking garage and sat in the dark, the city lights reflecting off my dashboard. I did not call a lawyer. I did not call my best friend to vent. I simply opened my laptop. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I was the silent architect of their lifestyle, and now I was going to be the silent liquidator of their control. For 12 years, I had been the one footing the bill for their version of family. It had been a subscription I never agreed to join. My mother thought that because her name was on the legal limited liability company, she held the steering wheel. She forgot that I was the one who built the engine. I started clicking. Revoke access, block user, and change administrative password. One by one, I froze every design system, every active project cloud, and every proprietary blueprint I had authored over the last decade. On paper, she owned the company. In reality, I held the decryption keys to every single $10.4 million asset. It took exactly 12 minutes to shut down the digital heart of the business I built from scratch. I stared at the glowing screen and remembered the tiny, cramped bedroom where I had spent my first few years as a freelancer. That was where the invisible chains were forged. It is a psychological trap we call the survivor's invisible chain. You stay in an abusive dynamic because you have become so good at surviving it that you mistake your endurance for loyalty. You tell yourself that if you can just make the business successful enough, if you can be useful enough, they will eventually love you as much as the child who does nothing. But useful is not the same as loved. I had been a prisoner of my own competence. I was the one who was always fine because I had to be. I realized tonight that my camouflage strength was just a cage I had helped them build. By making things easy for them, I had made it easy for them to discard me. I was the survivor who had forgotten that the door was never actually locked. This wasn't a breakdown, it was an audit. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for years, and tonight, the account was closed. My laptop glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts, numbers, and quiet retribution. My phone began to vibrate on the passenger seat. Rebecca, Mark, and Victoria. I did not answer a single one. I simply closed the lid, put the car in gear, and drove away from the wreckage of their expectations. I didn't reach 35 years of age and a $10.4 million valuation by accident. I reached it by being the person my family never had to worry about. In the household Mark and Rebecca built, there was an unspoken balance sheet that always ended in my sister's favor. Victoria was the gold in the golden child dynamic, an expensive, high-maintenance asset that required constant liquidity. I was simply the tool they used to generate it. I remember the year Victoria started her Master of Business Administration in Chicago. My parents paid for her tuition, her luxury apartment, and even her weekly groceries without blinking an eye. Meanwhile, I was 21, pulling 40-hour weeks at a campus tech lab and 20 more at a late-night diner. I wasn't doing it for character building. I was doing it because when I asked for a loan to buy a high-end rendering workstation for my architectural design, Mark told me to be realistic, and Rebecca suggested I find a used one on Craigslist. They had already stretched themselves thin for Victoria's future. This is what psychologists call the trap of normalized cruelty. In families like mine, The competent child's success isn't celebrated, it's harvested. Because I was resourceful and resilient, my parents felt it was morally acceptable to neglect my needs in order to subsidize Victoria's failures. They didn't see it as being cruel, they saw it as fair distribution. If Alyssa can handle it, then Alyssa should give. It is a toxic cycle where the child who does the most is rewarded with the least, simply because they have proven they can survive the deprivation. When I founded the firm 12 years ago, I didn't have the credit score or the banking relationships to secure a commercial lease. Rebecca, with her decades of experience in the banking world, offered to put the limited liability company in her name. She sat me down at the kitchen table with a stack of papers and told me it was just a formality. "It's just paperwork, sweetheart," she said. "You'll always be the one running things." I believed her because, at 23, I still thought family loyalty was a binding contract. I spent the next 12 years as the silent investor in their version of family. I provided the blood, the sweat, and the sleepless nights while Rebecca held the legal authority. I can still smell the stale, burnt coffee from the 3 a.m. shifts I pulled alone in that first cramped studio, designing the very projects that built our reputation. I thought my value was undeniable. I thought that if I made the business indispensable, they would finally see me as a partner instead of a resource. I was wrong. I was just an employee they were waiting to replace once Victoria needed a new title to distract from her mounting debts. I was a high-interest loan they had no intention of paying back. Today, the interest is due, and I am calling in the debt. Victoria walked into the office on Monday morning wearing a $3,000 Chanel suit and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She sat in my chair, the one with the lumbar support I bought specifically for 16-hour days, and started barking orders. But within 48 hours, the cracks were showing. Victoria has an MBA, but she cannot read a structural load diagram to save her life. She doesn't know our lead engineer's last name. She doesn't know that our biggest client, the Miller Group, expects a weekly brief by 10 a.m. Tuesday. She was trying to lead an army without knowing the terrain. By Wednesday, the office was in a state of quiet panic. Staff were texting me privately on my personal phone. "Victoria is cutting the discovery phase on the Lakeview project," one designer wrote. "She thinks research is too time-consuming." She was gutting the quality of our work just to impress my mother with short-term numbers. She was running a $10.4 million architecture firm like a suburban lemonade stand, oblivious to the fact that architecture is built on precision, not just prestige. She had the title, but she had none of the respect. Then came the call from Rebecca. I let it ring twice before picking up. Her voice was shrill, the calm bank manager, mask finally slipping. "Alyssa, you need to stop this childishness," she snapped. "Victoria says she can't access the main server and several clients are asking why their projects are on hold. You need to come in and fix it immediately. You are putting your sister in a very difficult position." I leaned back in my chair at my new, temporary workspace, watching the rain hit the window. "I'm not an employee, Mom," I said, my voice as flat as a balance sheet. "And as you said at dinner, she is the one in charge. She has the management background. Let her handle it." "You are being incredibly ungrateful," she continued, her voice rising. "We gave you everything. We are your family. You are destroying something we built together." I looked at the city skyline.
"No, Mom."
"You gave Victoria a gift. I built a business. There is a fundamental difference." I hung up before she could mention the grandkids again. My compassion had finally reached its credit limit. I didn't spend my time being angry. I spent it being industrious. Within a week, I had registered Bright North Studio. I didn't need a glass-walled office in the Loop to be a threat. I needed my brain and my reputation. I called the clients I had personally brought in, the ones who knew my cell number and the ones who had my personal email. I didn't beg. I just stated facts. There has been a change in leadership at the old firm. I have started a new venture. If you value my work and my design philosophy, my doors are open. 70% of them chose to follow the architect, not the office. But I wasn't finished. The old company owned the desks and the brand name, but I own the intellectual property of every design I had created under my personal professional license. I had my lawyer send a formal cease and desist. Every blueprint, every proprietary building technique, and every unfinished sketch currently on Victoria's desk belonged to me. By Friday, I had stripped the old company of its soul. It was now exactly what they deserved, a high-end office with no furniture and no product to sell. I spent the next 3 days auditing the betrayal. I didn't need to guess why my mother had suddenly pivoted to making Victoria the head of a firm she couldn't run. I hired a private investigator to look into Stephen, Victoria's husband. It took less than 48 hours to find the rot. Stephen had been playing a high-stakes game in the Phoenix real estate market and lost. He was overleveraged by nearly $2 million, and my mother had been quietly funneling company revenue to cover his interest payments for months. They didn't just want my business. They needed my liquidity to keep Stephen out of a courtroom. But the real kill shot came when my lawyer, Walter, received the full discovery of the succession documents Rebecca had tried to slide across the table at the Sky Lounge. I had refused to look at them then, but seeing them now in the cold light of a law office made my blood turn to ice. There was a signed intellectual property transfer agreement. It stated that I, Alyssa Hart, had voluntarily waived all rights to my past and future designs in exchange for a one-time payment of $10,000. I stared at the signature at the bottom of the page. It looked like mine. The loop of the A, the sharp tail of the H. It was a near-perfect imitation. But I had never seen this document in my life. I've spent 12 years obsessing over every line and angle of a blueprint. I know exactly how I signed my name, and I know I didn't sign this. Rebecca and Victoria hadn't just been greedy. They had committed felony forgery to steal my legacy. Walter leaned forward, tapping a second document. It gets worse, Alyssa. I tracked the filing dates. Victoria didn't just take over the company. She attempted to sell your 3 most valuable, award-winning designs to our biggest competitor, Apex Design, 2 weeks before the dinner. She needed a quick cash injection to bail Stephen out of his latest margin call. She was selling the foundation of your career to the very people who have been trying to put you out of business for a decade. I did not scream. I did not throw my coffee against the wall. I felt a strange, lethal calm. This wasn't a family dispute anymore. This was a criminal audit. My sister and my parents had crossed the line from toxic favoritism into organized fraud. They weren't just ungrateful. They were criminals. They thought they were playing a game of corporate chess, but they had forgotten that I was the one who designed the board. Walter, I said, my voice steady and clinical. File the criminal complaint for forgery. Contact Apex Design and inform them that they are currently in possession of stolen intellectual property and that any attempt to use those designs will result in a lawsuit that will bury them. And then, I want you to file a civil suit against Mark and Rebecca for misappropriation of trust funds. I have a suspicion they've been dipping into more than just the company's operating account. I walked out of Walter's office and looked at the Chicago skyline. The city felt open, transparent. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the reliable daughter or the invisible sister. I was the plaintiff. I was the one with the evidence, the numbers, and the law on my side. I had spent 12 years building a $10.4 million empire. Now, I was going to spend the next 12 minutes making sure that every single person who tried to steal it understood the exact price of their betrayal. Everything stayed silent for 72 hours while the legal bombs I dropped began to detonate in their bank accounts. Then the knocking started. I opened the door of my new studio to find Rebecca and Victoria standing in the hallway, the morning sun highlighting the gray in my mother's hair and the frantic, red-rimmed eyes of my sister. They didn't look like the owners of a $10.4 million firm anymore. They looked like the survivors of a shipwreck they had steered into the rocks themselves. "Alyssa, please," my mother whispered, her voice cracking as she reached out a hand I didn't take. "The bank called this morning. Because of your criminal complaint and the freeze on the accounts, they've called in Stephen's $2 million loan immediately. They are threatening to foreclose on the family home in 30 days if we don't release the design assets and drop the charges." Victoria stepped forward, her $3,000 suit wrinkled, her poise completely gone. "You can't do this, Alyssa. It was just a business decision. We were trying to protect the family legacy. If you go through with this, we lose everything. Your own parents will be on the street. Is that what you want? Is that your revenge? I looked at them, and for the first time in my life, I felt absolutely nothing. There was no surge of guilt, and no reflexive urge to apologize for their failure. I realized then that my heart wasn't breaking. It was simply settling its accounts. I was witnessing what psychologists call the power flip climax, that moment where the predator realizes they have become the prey because they underestimated their victim's worth. "You aren't worried about the family home, Mom," I said, my voice as cold and clear as the lake behind me. "You're worried about the performance. You're worried about the neighbors seeing the foreclosure sign. And Victoria, you aren't worried about the legacy. You're worried about the luxury condo you bought with my revenue that the bank is about to seize." This was the execution of the justice of the sower. I explained to them that true justice isn't just about punishing the past. It's about choosing where to plant your seeds for the future. For 12 years, I had planted my talent, my time, and my youth in their soil, only for them to try and salt the earth when they were done with me. Now I was planting in my own ground. "I already did the best thing for this family," I said, placing a copy of the criminal filing on the table between us. "I did it for 12 years when I carried your debts, your expectations, and your favoritism on my back without complaining. But I am not a resource to be harvested anymore. I am an architect, and I have moved on to a better project." My mother began to sob, but it felt performative, a final overdraft on an account that had reached its limit. I did not offer a tissue. I did not offer a compromise. I simply looked at the door. "The forensic audit is already complete," I finished. "Whatever happens next is a result of the signatures you forged, not the boundaries I set. Goodbye, Rebecca. Goodbye, Victoria." I closed the door, the click of the lock sounding like the final period at the end of a very long, very expensive sentence. 2 years have passed since I walked out of that Sky Lounge, and tonight the Chicago skyline looks different. It doesn't look like a series of unreachable targets. It looks like a ledger that has finally been settled. Bright North Studio just crossed $20 million in annual revenue. My team of 45 talented professionals is the real legacy I have built, a culture where competence is celebrated and loyalty is earned, not demanded through a birth certificate. We recently moved into a space twice the size of my old office, filled with natural light, messy whiteboards, and the hum of people who actually know how to build things. I am dating Eli now, a software engineer who respects my boundaries and my work without ever asking me to shrink myself to keep the peace. We are planning a trip to Europe, making choices based on what we want, not what we owe. The fate of my biological family was as predictable as a bad debt. Heartline Digital is gone. They sold the brand and a few remaining contracts to a larger firm for less than $500,000, a fraction of what it was worth when it had a soul. The proceeds barely covered the interest on Steven's failed real estate gambles. Rebecca had to sell the family home and move into a small apartment in a rougher part of town. Mark is taking whatever freelance consulting jobs he can find just to make ends meet. Victoria reached out once, asking if Bright North needed any help with management or coaching. I told her politely that we were fully staffed. My team deserves a professional environment, not a rehearsal for family dysfunction. I saw Rebecca at the grocery store a few weeks ago. She looked diminished, the weight of her choices finally settling on her shoulders. She started to apologize, but I did not need the words. I have already achieved closure. I went home that night, opened the old digital folder labeled Heartline, and stared at the files for a long minute. Then I hit delete. That is the justice of the sower, understanding that you are the real asset, not the company name or the signatures on a forged document. My success wasn't payback. It was proof that walking away from people who refuse to see your worth is the only way to truly survive. If you have ever felt pressured to stay in a cage because it was built by people who share your DNA, I want you to remember this. You can love your family and still say no. You are not a resource to be harvested for someone else's stability. If you found strength in this story, please share it to support others who are currently finding the courage to choose themselves.